So I'm back. In the last video, or a video on this, on these materials, I referred to a book by Minsky, the one that everybody bought that wasn't very good. Well, I did the same. Interesting, but not very good. The one that people should have bought was this one. Can it happen again? Essays on instability and finance. Much better. Now, Minsky's interesting as a character because he never got published in any of the economics journals. So sometimes it's quite difficult to find his actual papers. There is one that outlines his instability hypothesis, which published, I think, by the Cato Institute. And I will copy that onto reading lists online so that you've got a copy of it and you can look at it. All right, but it's simple and intuitive, and it's quite elegant in a theory, and it's quite descriptive, as opposed to it being numeric or mathematical and so on and so forth. There are others that have taken it forward to give it more mathematical credibility, in that people need to see the maths. Without the maths, then it doesn't have the kind of legitimacy, which is a shame, really, because it's intuitively elegant. And I'll take you through what it is now. Minsky's instability hypothesis built upon the antecedents of Marx, Schumpeter, who was actually Minsky's PhD supervisor, which is interesting. Fisher was very much an orthodox economist, mired in equilibrium models, Walrasian, Marshall's economics, but realized that he needed to revisit his work as a consequence of the Great Depression. And Fisher was the pioneer of the debt deflation theory. Now, I'm not sure if I can find a paper that is going to be easily accessible for that one, but if I can, I'll also link it as well. And Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, in that Keynes was the sort of like the intellectual heavyweight for much of Minsky's work. Now, I don't know whether I've talked about Keynes's work in the past, but Keynes is famous for the general theory, which is probably the worst to best book ever written. I've got a copy of it. Oh, it's over there somewhere. I've tried to read it and I gave up because it's awful. But fortunately, Keynes did write a series of short articles which outlined the general theory and everything that was important to it in some of the economics journals that were available at the time. And he wrote those in the sort of like 1933 through to 35, I think they were. I'm not going to link to them because you don't need to know everything that's in there. But if you are interested, then get back to me. In fact, I would probably urge you to read Skidelsky's book. Oh, hang on. Skidelsky's book, The Return of the Master, which outlines Keynes's work much better than Keynes ever did, actually. So that's a good one. And while I'm on this track, I want to recommend you this one as well, which is Wallenstein's book, Historical Capitalism. I've read this before and forgotten about it, really. And then reading The Great Complacence again inspired me to pick this up and have a look through this. Well, it is readable and it is brilliant. So I'm recommending that one as well. Hopefully I'll get some payment off these people peddling their books. I doubt it. But anyway, the point I'm making is that Minsky's theory is based on the theoretical antecedents of some of the big hitters in economics. What you will notice is that they are all disequilibrium economists. Okay. And what Minsky does, he starts from trying to understand the Great Depression and asks, could it happen again? And indeed, why has it not happened subsequent to that. Now, Minsky was writing in the 70s and the 80s. I think that his great work was 1985. He didn't live to see the Great Recession, 2008, global financial crisis, 2008. But what he did he had a historical perspective. So he looked back and he looked at the figures for 1930s, and he went back and he also looked at the data that was available for the financial crisis, the financial panic in America in 1857. I think it was. I think that's what I put down. Go back and check, double check me. So he's looking at why could something like the Great Depression happen again? Of course it did in 2007, 2008. So as I've said as well in the online materials, it requires a theory within which recession, depression and crisis is one possible state of the economy, which is different from the bulk of the orthodox thinking on economy, which determines that the state that economy works in is one of equilibrium. Self-correct goes back to equilibrium. So he's stepping aside from that, and he's working on a empirically driven basis. And included in his model, he includes money, time, in that it looks at cycles over time. He also uses the perspective, which is Keynes's perspective about the future being uncertain, it's unknowable. And he includes in it different categories, which would not necessarily be in orthodox thinking, but he includes in it workers, banks, capitalists, and governments. Okay, and these people, these agents within his theory, come together in order to craft the instability hypothesis. So what's interesting about his book, this one that's not very good, is that he is drawing attention to the fact that actually stability in the economy itself, is a precursor to the instability instability that's likely to, it's not instability, is it? It's instability that is likely to occur. So as I said in the earlier video, if we're looking at the right data sets, is that actually we can be forewarned about potential crisis occurring. So as I said, the model itself is really a descriptive model. Now, clearly there's an awful lot more detail in it than what I'm providing you with here. So I've just managed to encapsulate it all in one slide. But you can read about it with the literature that I've listed in reading lists online. So what do we need to know? Well, the financial cycle itself comprises a number of stages. In the first stage is the economy has just come from recession and is starting to improve. Okay, and this is what Minsky refers to as being the conservative stage. So firms are also, and the reason it's conservative is because firms and banks are very conservative about the future. Estimates of what the future is going to look like have been lowered down because we can still remember the recession that's behind us. And so as a consequence of that is that our business plans, our financial plans, our lending are also conservative, and our expected returns are quite low. Not surprisingly, they succeed because we have low expectations. We've taken on less debt in order to be able to finance those things. The internal hurdles for success rates are also quite low. The banks themselves are quite low as well. Expectations of banks are quite low, so they're not expecting high returns on their investments either, on the loans that they're making. So they become increasingly more and more successful, which means that the economy moves from this conservative stage into the second stage, which is about being euphoric. And in the euphoric stage is that because we've now got confidence, we borrow more. And because the economy is picking up, they are also successful as well. Banks become less risk averse and they're happy to start to invest in growth. Debt's still easily covered, and as a consequence of that, in essence, it pays to borrow. Okay? And further than that is that we can leverage what we're doing, borrow more money than perhaps we've got that we could cover, because we're now starting to see that we can cover those investments on future cash flows. But nevertheless, this as a pattern is still successful, and we move then from the euphoric into the speculative, which is not strictly there. It's the intervening stage between the euphoric and the Ponzi scheme. But once we start to become more speculative, Ponzi finance start to appear on the scene, where we're trading assets on the rising market through borrowing. Now, this depends, or the successes in this depend upon the returns that we're making from the investments being able to cover the costs of the debts. Once that shifts and that the cost of the debt is higher than the actual cash flow that's coming from the from our investments, is that Minsky suggests that Ponzi financiers make more investments in order to cover the cash flow. So we've now got a lag in the returns. So we are borrowing to make more investments to pay off the loans that we already hold. Okay, so that's when it becomes purely a Ponzi financing, which needs to be differentiated away from a Ponzi scheme. But during this Ponzi stage, is that banks will find that customers no longer pay their debts. And it's at this point that Minsky suggests that the role of the government, therefore, is to offset the worst excesses of the crisis. The prior stability that we'd seen in the conservative, the euphoric, and to an extent within the speculative stages of the economy, that stability is eventually it becomes destabilizing as we enter into more Ponzi financing. It's the stability itself that convinces people that they can actually make more money than perhaps the underlying economics suggests is feasible, and therefore it becomes destabilizing. So you can see that here from 2000 on, there's a decline in subprime lending as a consequence of the recession, which was brought about by the financial crisis or the collapse of the stock markets in 2000, which was the digital bubble and the digital collapse. So there's the recessionary pressure where people start to, and there's that recessionary period. And then next, there's the conservative period. And then following on from that, there's the more euphoric period, which then leads to the speculative and then the Ponzi. So the growth or the trajectory of subprime lending follows Minsky's model absolutely perfectly. And it's worth pointing out is that the data from the 1930s and the 1850s maps Minsky's model perfectly. Okay. So now let's look at more evidence. Let's look at the securitization of mortgage-backed securities from 2004 through to 2017. So this is post-crisis, but you can see the crisis there in 2006, 2007 very clearly. There are two lines. The blue one is what's known as agency issues, and the agency issues are the Fannie Mae's and the kind of like the sort of arm's length government bodies that were issuing mortgages. Now they've carried on post 2007, 2008 because what they've done is they've taken up some of the slack that the non-agency bodies, which are the banks, the investment banks, and so on and so forth. So there's a tremendous drop in the issuances of mortgage-backed securities from non-agency intermediaries. But the grey bars, I think, is where we really want to focus, is that there is a agency share of the mortgages declines because it's the non-agents that are actually picking up the subprime mortgages, and then they then compensate post-crisis because people still want mortgages, and their share of the market picks up. But from leading up to financial crisis, it's the non-agency, it's the banks, the investment banks, financial intermediaries that are issuing the majority of the mortgages and are moving further and further into issuing subprime mortgages. I'm going to interrupt myself again here because I want you to be clear that once intermediaries start to sell subprime mortgages, is that indicates the nature of the Ponzi stage of financing here. Now, it's not as simple as the outline of Minsky's Ponzi scheme, because it's slightly more complex than that. But subprime mortgages are being used, or the payments on subprime mortgages are being used in order to be able to make returns to those investors that have bought the subsequent derivatives. Once the interest rate payments slow or stop, then the derivatives fail. So the derivatives themselves are only secured providing that the income, the interest rate payments from mortgage holders, keeps up. Okay, and that's the notion of the Ponzi. So let's go back to the financial cycle, and let's apply this Minsky's model to the financial cycle. Again, depressionary period in the financial cycle, and then you've got the conservative and the euphoric. Euphoric leading into the speculative, and then ultimately into Ponzi financing there. So it maps Minsky's model really quite nicely. What's happening here in the grey columns are periods of recession, and the period of recession here after the dot-com crash was actually quite small, quite narrow. But one of the reasons why it was offset is because the banks were continuing to issue credit. Okay, remember that the financial cycle is an aggregate of credit. It is based on credit aggregate and mortgages. So the banks were continuing to lend at that particular point in time. But the curve has followed Minsky's model. What's interesting here is the point at which the country enters into recession, and that's here on the downturn of the credit cycle. Now that's explainable if we refer back to Richard Werner's view on banks as credit producers. Now, Werner's view is that banks are a requirement of the bank, an important function of the bank is to produce credit. And as it produces credit gets spent into the economy, and the economy grows. However, when banks start to take a hit, if their investments go bad, then they become conservative, and as a consequence of that is they withdraw credit facilities. So not that credit goes negative, is that the rate of growth of credit declines. So there's less money being pushed into the economy. That is the point at which Minsky suggests that the economy slows down. So credit doesn't need to go negative. It's just a reduction in the rate of growth of credit issuances. So if it's growing at 10%, 10%, 10%, but then it drops down into 8%, recessionary pressures will start to fall because the money supply is starting to decline. The amount of money in circulation becomes static or is declining, And as a consequence of that, aggregate demand also falls. The country itself, the economy itself, enters into a recession or start to feel recessionary pressures. That is where Minsky's view is that where the government needs to step in then at that particular point in time in order to be able to offset the worst impact of declines in credit. And of course, as we know, is that the banks received quite a considerable amount of help from the government at the time. So the government did exactly that. And we'll talk about that another time. Well, if you've made it this far, I think you've done very well. So reward yourself with a break, go and get a cup of coffee, and then let's come back and let's complete the rest of these online learning materials. See you later.